In this video, I'm going to be showing you some different versions of MAME that I personally like to use, and I'm going to be explaining how all three of the different ROM sets work. So by the end of the video, you're going to have a better idea of what version of MAME you want to use and which set is right for you. And towards the end of the video, I'm going to be giving my full recommendations on emulators and sets. Spoiler alert, it's a split set, but I will explain exactly why. Now we all know what MAME does, so I'm going to skip that bit and save everyone some time and jump straight into showing you the different versions of MAME that I like to use. And first up, we have just straight up normal MAME. So obviously this is the mainline fork of MAME and is generally used with the newest ROM sets. And this is the one that you should be using if you're a PC user and you want to keep yourself up to date with the latest dumps and fixes moving forward. Next up, we have MAME UI. And MAME UI is pretty much identical to normal MAME except with the UI. As you can see, it looks quite different. And for me personally, I much prefer this. And it's because all the information that I want is right on the surface. So it really is more information for geeks or for people that really want to get into configuration. Next up, we've got MAME 2003 and MAME 2003 Plus. These are based on much older versions of MAME and are generally used as libretto chords. And because they're based on older versions, they are far less demanding on hardware. So these are generally adopted by Raspberry Pi users or people with much lower end hardware. Now MAME 2003 is pretty much a straight up snapshot of MAME 0.78, but MAME 2003 Plus is kept up to date and does receive new games and fixes every once in a while. And lastly, we have Arcade 64, which as of last week is now my favourite of the bunch. Like MAME UI, it is identical to normal MAME, it just has a different user interface. But the main difference with this one, and it's the very reason I've converted to it, is that it only displays the arcade games. You might have noticed that MAME has ROMs for all types of different things, from computers to appliances. And MAME UI will display all of this. Arcade 64 will only display the arcade games. So with Arcade 64, I know that I'm not going to end up playing a ROM that's for a goddamn washing machine. And believe it or not, arcade stuff only accounts for about a third of the entire set. So with this, you're not having to rifle your way through a bunch of crap that you're just not interested in. Now, there are loads of different forks of MAME for a bunch of different reasons, some that are just for a couple of games specifically, and I'm not going to be covering those in this video because honestly it's just endless. But for MAME as a whole, these are the ones that you should be concerned about. Now we can move on to explaining ROM sets. Now this is a little bit confusing, but I am going to keep it as simple as possible. And towards the end of this section, I'm just going to give some use cases for each set to make it even easier. So there are three sets to choose from: merged, split, and non-merged. And at this point, you're probably asking yourself the question, why are there three different sets? And to answer this, we need to understand parents and clones. For the vast majority of these games, there have been multiple versions dumped. And these different versions could be a deluxe cabinet version, it could be a version with different characters, fixes, updates, multiple different reasons. And which version ends up being the parent ROM does vary from game to game. And for the most part, the parent versions are the preferred ones to use, but not in all cases. The best example of this is Pac-Man. This game was originally released as Puck-Man, but because people were getting creative and taking the curve off the P, they changed the name to Pac-Man. But because Puck-Man came out first, that is the parent version. Pac-Man is considered a clone of Puck-Man. Now how these parent game files and clone game files are organized in the file system is what dictates the set. So each of these sets has a different file system for their parents and clones. And they all have pros and cons depending on your use case. So let's take a look at a merged ROM. Now a merged ROM will always be named after the parent version. And if we take a look inside, we can see we have all of the files necessary to run that parent version. Now these folders here are the clone versions, and that's what a merged ROM is. Inside the parent zip file will also be the clone versions. So if we have a look in one of these folders here, we can see we have all of the additional files necessary to run that specific version. The only thing a split set does differently is this. It takes the clone versions out of the parent zip file and gives it a zip file all to itself. And this is beneficial if you're importing these games into a front end, especially if you're using clones. So because these are not buried inside of another zip file, it makes it more convenient to import into whatever front end you're using. One thing you must remember when using split ROMs is that if you're using a clone version, the parent version needs to be present in the same ROM folder. And this is because these clone versions only contain the additional files they need to run. They still need the files from the original parent version to be able to play. So just to put this into terms, a merge set will contain the clone versions inside the parent zip file, and a split set will have a zip file for every single version. Now, non-merged ROMs are a bit easier to explain. Like a split set, they have a zip file for every single version, except inside the clones, they contain all of the data that it needs to be run independently. So that's all of the parent data and all of the clone data that it needs. So you don't need the parent present if you just want to play a clone. That makes non-merged ROMs a really good option if you just want to play a couple of games but not use an entire set. And that's just because these can be run completely independently with no other files needing to be present. So which set is best for you? Now, I'd fully recommend a merge set to anyone that wants a full set and to just jump straight in. And if you're not really into front ends or refining your MAME games, this is the one for you. So you can just use the MAME GUI to launch your games and just play all of it to your heart's content. So if you're just a general user and you just want to have a play, this is the one for you. Now, a split set I would recommend for anyone that uses front ends or wants to cull their set. So if you want to delete all of the garbage out of the set and refine it all down, a split set is so much easier to do that with. So this one I would recommend to anyone that likes to use front ends or organize their ROMs. And as I mentioned earlier, non-merged ROMs are great if you just want a couple of games but not the entire set. I wouldn't actually recommend a full set of non-merged ROMs because the file size is massive, and culling down a split set is overall a smaller file size than culling down a non-merged set. Now, whichever one of those that you go with, you need to make sure that the version of MAME that you're using matches the version of the set that you're using. So if you're using MAME 0.258, you need to make sure that you're using set 0.258 because these are kept up to date in tandem. So as a long-time user of MAME, what do I recommend? So for the MAME emulator itself, I fully recommend Arcade64 if you're just into the arcade side of it. If you want to play everything that MAME has to offer, go with MAME UI Classic. Now, as for sets, I'm always going to suggest a split set, and that's just because the additional convenience that that set brings. A lot of issues that I see with front-end users with MAME does stem from the confusion a merge set brings. A split set has everything in individual zipped files, so everything is represented with a zip, which makes things just so much easier. Now, if I was using a Raspberry Pi or much lower end hardware, I would go with MAME 2003 Plus as a retro core. Unlike just MAME 2003, this is still under active development, but with lower end hardware in mind. Now, normal MAME does also have a RetroArch core, however, I recommend not using it. Its compatibility in comparison to just straight up MAME is not that great, and it just adds another layer to the confusion. There we go, that's my recommendations on what you should be using with MAME. Now I'm going to put a link in the description below for MAME UI and Arcade64 if you want to grab those. Now you might be interested in my MAME pre-configuration project. Basically what I'm doing is going through every single MAME arcade game, pre-configuring all controls and making sure everything is working correctly, which is a massive undertaking. And if you're interested in that, I'll put a link for the first video in the series in the description below. So if you liked today's video, slam me a thumbs up, and if you want to keep up to date, you know what to do. And apart from that, go play some games. Adios.